Imagine it is the 14th of November, 1922. You are a 43-year-old baker living in Berlin, Germany. Your bakery has been in your family for 2 generations. You wake before sunrise every morning, the same as your father did, the same as his father before him. The smell of bread fills your apartment above the shop. Your savings sit in a post office account. 80,000 marks enough to retire on, or so you believed 2 years ago. You have 2 children in school. You have a cat named Bruno who sleeps beside the oven. Life is not glamorous, but it is solid. It is yours. This morning, a kilogram of flour costs 5,000 marks. Last January, it cost 250. You do the arithmetic in your head, and it does not make sense. You have more money in your account than you have ever had in your life, measured in numbers on a page, and yet, somehow, impossibly, you are poorer than you have ever been. You walk past the newspaper stand and see a headline, "The government has printed more money again. Someone on the street is laughing. Someone else is crying. A man in a long coat gets into a car outside the hotel across the road. He looks calm. He looks like he slept well. He is carrying a briefcase and saying nothing." You will later learn that man had, months ago, moved everything he owned out of marks. If you have ever wondered why certain families emerge from economic catastrophes richer than when they entered, while everyone else loses everything, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It is not pessimism dressed up as analysis. It is a pattern. It has repeated itself in more than a dozen countries across more than a century of modern economic history. And it always follows the same sequence. The assets leave first, then the collapse comes, and most people only find out which category they were in after it is too late. If this kind of historical clarity is useful to you, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it keeps you in front of what most people never see coming. So what is actually happening? Before we get to the cases, there's a foundational truth that holds across every single one of them. Currency collapse is not an event, it is a process. It is slow at first, then terrifyingly fast at the end. And the wealthy do not survive it because they are smarter, necessarily. They survive it because they are earlier. They see the early signals and act on them, not at the climax, but in the quiet period before anything officially begins. Think of it like a building on fire. The smoke appears long before the flames become visible. Most people wait until they can feel the heat. By then, the stairways are full. The people who got out were the ones who smelled the smoke and moved, while others were still debating whether it was real. The mechanism is simple. Governments that are in serious debt, facing political pressure, or fighting a war they cannot afford to pay for, will almost always expand the money supply. That means they print more currency. Hyperinflation, which is when prices rise so fast that money loses its value faster than people can spend it, is the extreme version. But you do not need full hyperinflation for the damage to be catastrophic. Even moderate inflation, sustained over years, destroys savings held in cash or in government bonds. These are essentially promises from the government to pay you back later in the same currency that is losing value. These are the first assets wealthy families liquidate. Not because they are greedy, because they understand what money actually is. Money is not wealth. Money is a claim on wealth. And when the government controls the printing press, that claim can be diluted quietly while everyone is looking the other way. This brings us to the first case, and one of the most studied currency catastrophes in modern history. In Germany between 1921 and 1923, the Weimar Republic faced debts it could not repay from World War I and reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles. The solution the government chose was to print money. At the start of 1921, $1 US bought roughly 90 German marks. By November 1923, $1 US bought 4.2 trillion marks. That is not a typo, 4.2 trillion. Prices doubled every 2 days. Workers were paid twice a day so they could buy food before prices rose again. Wheelbarrows of currency were pushed through the streets just to purchase bread. The savings of an entire middle class were wiped out in months. But here is what most accounts leave out. The industrialists were fine. Hugo Stinnes, one of the wealthiest men in Germany at the time, became significantly richer during the hyperinflation period. He borrowed enormous sums in marks, used that money to purchase physical assets, factories, mines, ships, and real estate. Then he repaid those loans later in marks that were worth almost nothing. He bought real things with borrowed paper, then paid back the debt in confetti. He understood that when a currency collapses, debt denominated in that currency also collapses in real terms. His obligations shrunk while his assets held value. Meanwhile, the baker held his savings in marks. The pensioner held his retirement in government bonds, which were paid in marks. The schoolteacher kept her savings in a post office account. All of them followed the conventional wisdom of their day. All of them were financially destroyed by it. The pattern here is precise. The assets that get abandoned first are cash holdings in the local currency and government-issued debt. The assets that get accumulated instead are hard, physical, internationally priced things, and the timing matters enormously. Stennis began his acquisitions in 1919 and 1920, well before the crisis peaked. By the time most ordinary Germans realized what was happening, those assets were already off the market or priced beyond reach. Here's something I want you to sit with before we continue. If the German middle class had understood in 1920 what Stennis understood in 1919, could they have done anything differently? Most of them had access to foreign exchange. Many of them had access to farmland or real property. The information about the reparations was public, so why did they not act? Drop your answer in the comments. Think about it seriously, because your answer to that question is actually the answer to a much more important question. What I am about to show you in the next example makes that question even more uncomfortable because it happened again in a completely different country. Argentina is a country that has experienced more than one financial crisis, but the collapse of 2001 is among the most instructive case studies. Argentina had pegged its currency, the peso, to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 ratio since 1991. This peg, called convertibility, was meant to create stability, and for a time it appeared to work. The economy grew, investment came in, the peso felt solid. But the peg required the government to hold enough US dollars to back every peso in circulation. And Argentina was spending more than it earned. By the late 1990s, the country was in recession, unemployment was rising, and the government's debt had become impossible to service. Banks began to feel the pressure. Foreign investors began to move their money out quietly. Capital flight accelerated through 2000 and into 2001. In December 2001, the government froze bank accounts. Ordinary Argentines woke up to find they could not access their savings. The measure was called the corralito, which translates roughly as the little enclosure. Citizens were limited to withdrawing 250 pesos per week. In January 2002, the government abandoned the peg entirely. The peso devalued by roughly 70% almost immediately. A savings account that held the equivalent of $10,000 in January 2001 held the equivalent of roughly $3,000 by mid-2002. The destruction was swift and total for those who had not moved, but the wealthy had moved. Capital outflows from Argentina between 1999 and 2001 amounted to estimates ranging from 20 billion to 40 billion US dollars, much of it ending up offshore. The wealthy did not wait for the corralito. They saw it coming, the same way you can see a dam cracking before it breaks. The political signals were there. The debt metrics were visible. The banking sector stress was trackable. They acted. Then the gates closed. What did ordinary Argentines hold? Their savings in pesos, their retirement accounts and local pension funds that were heavily invested in government bonds, which defaulted. Small businesses denominated in pesos were crushed. The corralito did not hurt the wealthy because the wealthy were already out. It was specifically a cage built for people who had waited. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Now observe what these two cases share, separated by 80 years and 2 continents. In Germany 1923 and Argentina 2001, the warning signs preceded the collapse by years. In both cases, government debt was the core underlying problem. In both cases, the mechanism of destruction was the devaluation of paper claims. The asset class that absorbed the most harm was cash savings in the domestic currency and government-backed financial instruments. And in both cases, wealthy families moved out of those exact assets early, quietly, without announcement. This is not a coincidence. Now look at the third case, and here is where it gets genuinely surprising. Lebanon entered a financial crisis that began visibly around 2019. The Lebanese pound had been pegged to the US dollar at roughly £1,500 to the dollar since 1997. The banking system attracted deposits with high interest rates. The system worked as long as deposits kept flowing in, but Lebanese banks were using those deposits to fund the government's deficit. By 2019, the flow of new deposits was slowing. In October 2019, mass protests erupted over economic conditions and political corruption. Banks shut their doors. When they reopened, informal capital controls began. Within months, the parallel exchange rate had diverged massively. By 2023, the rate reached above £90,000 to the dollar. The pound had lost more than 98% of its value in just 4 years. A middle-class Lebanese family with $100,000 US dollars in 2018 watched it become worth less than $2,000. And who had moved it out? Wealthy Lebanese depositors and politicians moved approximately $6 billion out in the months just before controls began. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand because the alternative is too uncomfortable. Questioning the stability of the bank where you keep your savings requires a kind of mental courage. If you are still here, hit subscribe. In every collapse, the human cost followed a specific social geography. The middle class absorbed the majority of the damage. In Weimar Germany, teachers and civil servants found themselves selling furniture just to eat. Some families dissolved. Some simply did not recover. In Argentina 2001, the middle class again bore the primary damage. Unemployment reached 21.5%. 5 different presidents held office in 2 weeks. In Zimbabwe, hyperinflation reached sextillion percent. The urban middle class holding local savings were economically erased. Currency crises redistribute wealth from those who hold claims on the collapsing currency to those who hold assets that exist outside of it. Real assets, hard commodities, foreign exchange, productive land, these are what retain value when paper claims dissolve. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you recognize the signals. In Russia, 1991, and Venezuela, 2016, those who preserved wealth shared specific behaviors, early action, and ownership of assets priced in other units. They reduced domestic cash and government debt exposure long before the crisis peaked. None of this is financial advice. It is historical analysis. Back in Berlin, November 1922, the baker did not make it through the hyperinflation intact. He lost his savings because he trusted the instrument he was told was responsible. The man in the long coat had trusted hard assets and foreign currency because he had reason to doubt paper promises. Every currency collapse is preceded by a period in which it was considered unthinkable by those who lived inside it. Surviving financially requires deciding early that your first obligation is not to trust the institution, but to verify it. This video is not for everyone, but if someone in your life needed to hear this, share it with them. It might change their world. Subscribe for more historical analysis that most channels never go near. I will see you in the next one.